Heidi-ho there, and welcome to the 5-Minute Film School, where I, your humble host, Rich, impart my vast filmmaking knowledge on you, the lowly Utes of America, and the rest of the YouTube-verse. Applause, please. Now, I know last week I said that we'd be doing guerrilla filmmaking tactics in this episode, but someone brought up to me the fact that with all this glorious new equipment, some people might not know how to use it. So for those of you who know how to use the equipment, you don't really need to watch these episodes, but you can if you want to. So let's just dive in. So this is the basic camera and sound for our guerrilla one-man crew. First, camera. Turn it on. There's a switch that says on and off. Pretty simple. Now I know some of you will want to shoot on auto. It's a temptation to just let the camera do the thinking for you. Resist it. Cameras are stupid. Don't trust them. There's only 3 things you need to worry about on any camera: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now the aperture is just a hole in the lens that lets the light in. That's all it is. The shutter on the camera is just how fast it's opening and closing, and the slower, the more light it's coming in. So if you're doing it at 30, as opposed to 500, that would be much slower and that would let a lot more light in. ISO has to do with the grain, or in film terms it used to be grain. Now in digital terms it's sort of this digital noise. But the higher the ISO, the more light that it's going to read, even in dark situations. But ultimately you don't want to have your ISO set too high. And realize that with the 60D or some of the other cameras, their menus and stuff are going to be a little bit different. So on your LCD screen you'll see a meter. Now this is the light meter. It tells you how much light the camera is getting. Now this can be misleading because the camera always shoots for the middle, which means if you have a bright background or a dark one like here, the lens is seeing all that light and it's saying, holy crap, it's way too bright or dark. So if your subjects are in shade in the foreground, they're dark. This is why tourist sunset shots are always fucked up, because people who take the pictures don't realize that the camera is just shooting for the background and not them. One way to get a good exposure on your subject is to make a light reading directly on them, like to move up to them. If they're wearing like a black shirt or something, find the darkest spot on them or their face and get a light reading off of that. It's called spot metering. Now with that you can make a basic exposure. Focus. Focus will be much easier on a camera if the aperture is at 5.0 or above. Now you have all these numbers, 5.0, 1.8, 2.8. The only thing you really need to know is the smaller the aperture, the higher that number. So 22 is, if you look at the lens, it's like a little teeny pinhole. When you open it up to 4, 5, 6, it's much bigger. What this causes is something called depth of field. Now let's say you bought the Nifty 50, for example. If you shoot with it wide open at 1.8 aperture, the depth of field will be extremely shallow, as you see here. If you take the same shot and close the aperture down and adjust the shutter speed, you'll have the same shot with a little leeway in depth of field. Now some people love shallow depth of field. It looks very cinematic, and I'm one of those, me included. But it can be problematic if your subject is moving a lot, or if you are moving, because maintaining the focus will be hard. So depending on how confident you are moving forward, you can go ahead and adjust the aperture as you see fit. But for beginners, I'd stay clear of too much shallow depth of field. Next thing is settings. On some of the other cameras, you may have to scroll through the menu and find the settings. On the 7D, it's just this little button right here. You press that, and the little menu pops up, and you scroll through them. And as you can see, you have standard, portrait, landscape, neutral. But let's just stick with standard for now. Next thing, white balance. Here's the thing. Tungsten light is yellow. Daylight is bluer. If your camera's set to tungsten and you go outside and you shoot, everything's going to look blue. Likewise, if your camera's set to daylight and you go inside, everything's going to look way too yellow. Press this white balance button, and again, it's going to be different on something like the 60D or the 3Ti. You're going to have to scroll through the menus to do the same thing. You have a tungsten light option and a daylight option. You can stick with auto white balance if you're more comfortable with that, and it'll make that decision for you. Now at the very end of the dial is this little button that says K. Now K is your custom white balance setting. The tungsten burns at 3200 K. 3200 Kelvin. If you don't want to play by the rules, you can bump up the temperature. Instead of setting it at 3200 Kelvin, you can set it at 3600 Kelvin or 4000 Kelvin. Daylight burns at 5600 Kelvin or K. So you can do it at 4500 K if you want it to be a little bluer. If you want it to be a little more yellow, you would bump it up to, say, 6600 K, and that would make the picture look a lot more yellow. Now for focus, it's pretty simple. This little focus ring right here, you just manipulate it. On the Canons have this little box that you can move around. You find whatever it is you're trying to focus on, and then you use the magnifying tool to focus in on it as close as possible and use that as your focal point. Well, that's pretty much it, my little biatches. Next up is sound. Click up here, right here, where the little thingy's popping up, to go to that vid, and meanwhile, subscribe to my web series, The Adventures of Dude and Bro, and leave comments and questions, or anything else, insults if you like. And thanks for watching. YOLO!